All right, now we're in the religion and morality pillar for the Millennials, 1981 through 1996 generation. Faith without institution, morality without monopoly. All right, so millennials are born into a society that still talked like God was the center, while the institutions claiming moral authority began collapsing in public view. They inherited a culture where religion wasn't just private belief, it was identity, politics, schooling, law, and family hierarchy. But unlike earlier generations, millennials didn't experience faith as a stable canopy over the world. They experience it as a battlefield. Culture wars on TV, purity language in schools, moral panic in media, and then crucially, scandal, hypocrisy, and state power fused with righteousness. Millennials did not abandon morality or spirituality. They dismantled the assumption that moral authority belonged to institutions. Raised during the final era when religion still claimed cultural legitimacy, they watched faith become entangled with political power, war justification, corporate branding, and institutional self protection. What fractured trust was not belief itself, but hypocrisy without accountability. So, millennials didn't simply become less religious, many became post institutional. They split spirituality from religion, ethics from brand loyalty, God from gatekeepers. The moral center didn't disappear, it migrated from churches and authorities into the nervous system, the conscience, the research habit, and the lived body. By adulthood, millennials learn to treat morality as experiential, examinable, and embodied rather than inherited or decreed. Many migrated out of churches and into nervous systems, therapy rooms, ancestral memory, and decentralized belief ecosystems. This was not nihilism, it was post illusion ethics, morality rebuilt after authority proved unsafe. The promise phase, 1980s through the early 1990s. Religion as stability, community, and moral order, the last era of moral certainty. Millennials entered childhood while adults around them still treated religion as a stabilizing force. Church as community, pastors as trusted counselors, family values as social glue. Even for households that weren't devout, religion still functioned as a shared moral language: right, wrong, pure, impure, worthy, and unworthy. But here's the key millennial difference: they were trained on certainty while the culture underneath was already fracturing. By the time many millennials were old enough to consciously evaluate belief, the moral authority they'd been handed was already showing cracks. Rising divorce, accelerating consumerism, widening inequality, and media turning morality into performance. This is the first moral imprint. Morality was taught as obedience, not integrity. And millennials are the generation that eventually refused to keep confusing those two. Core message absorbed: religion equals moral safety, church equals community, authority equals guidance, and belief equals virtue. This moral environment felt parental rather than coercive, but the institutional foundations beneath it were already shifting. The moral branding era, 1990s, 1993 through 1996, law, authority, and the body as policy era begins, when faith becomes a cultural position. By the late 90s, millennials were teens in a media world that turned moral debate into entertainment. Religion became headline category, not just faith, but controversy. The unspoken training was subtle and brutal. If you're good, you'll be rewarded. If you follow the script, you'll be safe. If you question too loudly, you'll be punished. Then life didn't follow that script, and millennials noticed. This is where the thread about authority collapse connects. Once morality becomes branding, it stops feeling like truth. It starts feeling like control. As millennials entered adolescence, religion increasingly appeared as branding. rather than formation. Megachurch expansion, youth targeted faith marketing, and simplified moral messaging created a subtle shift. Belief became something to display, not necessarily to embody. At the same time, morality narrowed. Complex ethics, single issue focus, compassion to compliance, and introspection to identity signaling. Millennials sense the contradiction early. If morality is sacred, why does it feel strategic? Curiosity didn't vanish, it became suspicious. Millennials came of age during a period when moral conflicts increasingly moved from sermons into laws, court battles, and institutional mandates. One signal event, worth naming because it marks the era's tone, is the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Signed in 1993, a major moment in modern U.S. legal debates over religious liberty versus governmental power. Whether millennials grew up in conservative churches, progressive congregations, or secular homes, the atmosphere became the same. Belief wasn't just belief anymore, it was governance. That fusion matters because millennials didn't just lose trust in religion, they lost trust in the marriage of righteousness and power. Once the state starts arguing morality, morality becomes suspicious because now has funding, coercion, and PR. Late 1990s, culture wars and the collapse of shared reality. 9/11 and the spiritual fracture, moral confusion explosion, 2001 to 2003. When religion appeared as a weapon. For millennials, 9/11 marked a spiritual rupture as much as a political one. 9/11 didn't just shift geopolitics, it detonated the moral narrative architecture millennials were raised on. Because the story stopped making sense. War was preached as righteousness, surveillance was sold as protection, dissent was framed as betrayal, fear became a virtue. If you aren't afraid, you're naive. Uncertainty became suspicious. If you're certain, you're probably lying. Religion surfaced globally as justification for violence, language of war, banner for nationalism, and tool for fear consolidation. Faith became visibly weaponized. Moral language was no longer safe. It could sanctify anything. This moment seeded a lifelong instinct. If belief can be used to excuse harm, it must be questioned. This is the moment the millennial religious moral psyche splits into two major branches. Those who clung harder to certainty because fear made certainty feel like oxygen, and those who became researching everything because certainty started feeling like manipulation. Either way, the effect was the same. The old moral authority stopped being default. The betrayal years 2002 through 2010. Institutional exposure and truth and trust collapse. Throughout the 2000s, waves of institutional scandal, cover ups, and moral contradiction confirmed what many millennials already felt. Institutions protect themselves first. Religion lost credibility not through disbelief, but through misalignment. Sacred language versus harmful behavior, moral authority versus legal evasion, and confession versus concealment. Millennials did not reject faith, they rejected unquestionable power. The receipts era, mid 2000s, new atheism, skepticism, and evidence culture. The rise of public skepticism in the mid 2000s trained millennials in a new moral posture. Ask for proof, examine claims, challenge tradition, and separate truth from tenure. Even millennials who remained spiritual adapted this method. Faith without accountability no longer passed inspection. Morality became audible. 2002, the institutional innocence myth dies publicly. If 9/11 cracked the moral narrative, the early 2000s scandals shattered the idea that institutions were inherently trustworthy. A landmark example is the public exposure of widespread clergy abuse and cover ups in the Catholic Church, propelled into mainstream consciousness in 2002 through major investigative reporting. This matters for millennials because it's not a scandal, it is a template. Authority claims moral superiority. Authority harms the vulnerable. Authority protects itself. The truth comes out late. The victims pay the cost. Once a generation learns that pattern, it doesn't stop at religion. It spreads into politics, medicine, education, and war. 2006 through 2007, the new atheism era and intellectual revolt. In the mid 2000s, a very millennial moral response surged public, intellectual, confrontational disbelief. Books like the Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion, 2006, and Christopher Hitchens' God is Not Great, 2007, became cultural signal fires, not just about atheism, but about rage at hypocrisy and coercion. This isn't just people stopped believing, it was people stopped consenting to being morally managed. 2010s, spiritual but not religious, trauma, literacy, and moral decentralization. As millennials entered adulthood, the shift solidified. Moral authority moved from institutions to lived experience. Spiritual seeking moved from churches to podcasts, therapy, semantics, books, nature, and ritual. Shame based morality lost power. Consent based ethics gained power. Because God said so lost leverage. To show me the evidence became standard. And on that data level, this is the era where religious nuns became a major generational force, with major research tracking generational replacement and the rise plateau of disaffiliation. Millennials didn't become immoral, they became anti hypocrisy. Deconstruction and private spirituality, 2010s. Meaning without gatekeepers. By adulthood, millennials did not move toward emptiness, they moved toward self directing meaning systems. Therapy and trauma frameworks, nervous system literacy, meditation and semantics, ancestral memory and indigenous awareness, astrology, symbolism, mythic frameworks. Spirituality became experimental rather than doctrinal. If it doesn't heal the body, it isn't sacred. 2015, the authority breakpoint on marriage morality. The Supreme Court's Upper Geffel versus Hodges decision, June 26, 2015, legalized same-sex marriage nationwide, a major moral authority turning point because it publicly ended one of the biggest institutional religious battlegrounds in U.S. civil law. Whether someone supported the ruling or not, millennials absorbed the deeper message. The moral order is negotiable, political, and changing, not eternal and fixed. That made moral certainty harder to fake. It also forced a question millennials never stopped asking. Is your morality about love or about control? Morality without monopoly. Ethics built from lived harm. Millennial morality reorganized around consent, accountability, boundaries, harm reduction, and lived experience over abstract doctrine. This created clarity and a shadow. Moral perfectionism, online purity spirals, fear of being wrong, and righteousness without mercy. Moral authority didn't disappear, it decentralized. Generational differentiator, Gen X versus millennials. Gen X distrust as survival, millennials investigation as responsibility. Gen X sensed institutional failure, millennials mapped it. Millennials were raised under the last wave of social moral certainty, but they matured inside an era of public institutional collapse. War framed as righteousness, surveillance framed as safety, scandals exposing protected predators, and courts redefining moral order in real time. They learned early that authority could be loud and still be wrong, and that institutions often protect themselves before they protect the vulnerable. So millennials shifted morality from obedience to integrity, from doctrine to discernment, from inherited rules to lived ethics. This is why they don't automatically trust religious institutions, but they still obsess over truth, healing, consent, and meaning. They didn't lose the moral center, they relocated it. Millennial religious and moral imprint. Millennials learned that morality cannot be outsourced. Authority must be examinable. Belief without accountability is unsafe. Truth is experiential, not hierarchical. Institutions are not synonymous with ethics. They are not anti faith, they are post illusion. Millennials did not lose religion, they lost trust in institutions that claimed moral authority without moral responsibility, and rebuilt meaning where it could no longer be taken from them. So we have 1980s religious institutions still culturally dominant, 90s megachurch expansion, faith branding, and moral simplification. 96 Telecommunications Act and media consolidation affects moral narratives. 2001 9/11 religion enters war rhetoric explicitly. 2002 to 2009 institutional scandals and trust erosion. Mid 2000s new atheism and evidence-based skepticism surge. 2010s rise of religious nuns, deconstruction culture. 2015 plus spirituality reframed as healing, embodiment, and nervous system repair. Indigenous memory and moral contrast. Spirituality without conversion, ethics without control. An institutional religion lost moral credibility. Millennials didn't just deconstruct, they started scanning history for moral systems that survived without coercion. They were the first mass media and digital generation to encounter indigenous spirituality not primarily as myth, stereotype, or erased history, but as living moral systems that endured institutional violence and refused domination. This matters because while institutional Western religion was collapsing under exposure, indigenous tradition stood as a quiet counterexample. Spirituality without coercion, morality without empire, ritual without conversion, ethics rooted in land, reciprocity, and consequence. For millennials raised inside collapsing moral authority, indigenous worldviews didn't register as alternative religion. They registered as proof that spirituality does not require domination to endure. Historical backdrop millennials inherited. Millennials came of age during a delayed reckoning with indigenous history. Widespread public acknowledgement of boarding schools, forced conversion, land theft, and cultural erasure entered mainstream education unevenly in the 1990s and 2000s. Churches that once claimed moral authority were increasingly revealed as active participants in cultural deconstruction, not neutral bystanders. The myth that Western religion equaled moral superiority quietly collapsed. This created a silent inversion in the millennial psyche. If the institutions that called themselves holy committed systemic harm, what does holiness actually mean? Indigenous traditions answered without preaching. Holiness is relational, not hierarchical. Why indigenous ethics resonated with millennials structurally. Millennials did not adapt indigenous spiritually en masse, but they absorbed its ethical architecture. Land is moral actor, not resource, not property, a living participant with memory and consequence. This reframed morality from belief correctness to impact awareness. Elders as stewards, not rulers. Wisdom was earned through relationship and service, not title, charisma, or divine appointment. This contrasts sharply with institutional abuse dynamics millennials were already mapping. Ceremony as regulation, not performance. Ritual existed to restore balance, nervous system, community, land, not to signal virtue or enforce compliance. This directly aligned with millennial somatic trauma informed spirituality. No conversion mandate. Truth did not require universal adoption to remain valid. For millennials burned by moral absolutism, this was revolutionary. The 2000s to 2010s Indigenous prescience, prescience re-enters moral discourse. As millennials entered adulthood, Indigenous ethics surfaced in real-time moral conflict, not abstract history. Environmental justice movements foregrounded Indigenous land protection frameworks. Water, foods, and sovereignty issues reframed morality as caretaking versus extraction. Events like Standing Rock were not experienced as protest stories, but as moral litmus tests. Who pays the cost of progress? Who is protected by law? Whose spirituality is criminalized versus sanctified? Indigenous moral systems expose a truth millennials already suspected. Modern institutions often legalize harm, then call it order. What millennials took and what they rejected. Millennials did not adapt Indigenous spirituality wholesale. They selectively integrated principles that aligned with post-institutional ethics. They absorbed reciprocity, consent with land, intergenerational responsibility, non-hierarchical moral authority, and spirituality as lived relationship. They rejected romanticization, ownership of sacred practices, performative spiritual consumerism, authority without accountability. This is why millennial spirituality often includes acknowledgement rather than adoption, respect rather than replacement. Indigenous wisdom as a moral mirror, not a template. For millennials, Indigenous traditions functioned less as belief systems and more as moral mirrors. They revealed that morality can exist without empire, spirituality can survive genocide and still refuse domination. Ethics can be place based, embodied, and non universal without being relativistic. This helped millennials articulate a core realization. If a moral system survives without force, it is likely rooted in truth rather than control. Integration into millennial moral identity. By the 2010s, Indigenous influence was quietly woven into millennial ethics. Land acknowledgements, imperfect but meaningful attempts, environmental morality framed as sacred obligation, healing work tied to ancestry and lineage, spirituality framed as repair, not obedience, not as a trend, but as course correction. Indigenous imprint on millennial morality. Indigenous traditions taught millennials without demanding belief. Morality is relational, not decreed. Spirituality must answer to consequence. Authority is proven through care. Land remembers, and survival without domination is possible. This didn't replace faith, it exposed a lie millennials were already dismantling, that morality requires monopoly to function. Millennials didn't turn to Indigenous wisdom because it was ancient. They turned to it because it endured without control. All right, so I hope you enjoyed that section of my millennial generational video series, and that was all about religion and morality. And of course, I am mapping the Indigenous teachings because I have done a heck of a lot of Indigenous ancestral work myself. That was my entire 2025. I spent this whole year since March, really getting into genealogy and tracing back my roots and working on that. So that is why I'm incorporating Indigenous teachings. That is my own journey personally. And I can certainly see the parallels in many, many, many different systems. So it is my soul work, soul journey here to include that into my teachings. So I think it's extremely important, as well as polarity work. Anyways, the next section, pillar 6 of 9, I have 9 pillars to go through, and then I will get into the astrology. So, my next pillar is about technology and medicine. So, this is getting into technology. This will probably be the most fun portion. We're talking about CDs, tapes, CDs, MP3s, consoles, computers, gaming, phones, all of the technology. So that is quite fun for this generation. We've lived through a lot. We are the bridge generation when it comes to technology. So, yeah, this is going from a heavier, more kind of, I don't even think it's controversial at this point, but whatever. The religious moral is more emotional. I understand it's not as fun. It can be a more triggering topic, but yeah. So anyways, hope you enjoyed this video. Like and subscribe. Feel free to comment your thoughts and feelings, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you so much for being here.